Hey, it's good to be with you again today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because the person I'm about ready to introduce you to I've had very good friends, mentors of mine, talk about him for years, and so it's an honor today to finally have a chance to meet Pete Scazzero face to face. Pete, welcome.
Tony, great to be here. Thank you very much.
For those that may not be familiar with your backstory, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I pastor a church and have been in the same church actually for 20, wow, opening into my 29th year in New York City, Queens, so inner city of New York, very multinational, international, multiracial. Planted it in 1987, and out of that has come a whole discipleship paradigm we call today emotionally healthy spirituality. And I've written some books on that and spoken on it. And actually just 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, I just did Succession as well. And so I'm on staff as a teaching pastor now and pastor at large. But so it's been a wonderful journey, and I've had opportunity to travel a bit and see what's going on around the world, as well as, be on my home base here in New York, in Queens.
So you mentioned emotionally healthy spirituality. You did a book too on emotionally healthy churches. And today, though, we're talking about this new book. It's Emotionally Healthy Leaders. And I'm excited about digging into this a little bit with you over the next few moments. But what I appreciate about your writing, Pete, is that you're not talking as someone that's disconnected from the challenges that you're writing about in your book. This is coming out of your real life experiences, isn't it?
Yes. So actually, comes out of you're kind of like Paul doing contextual theology, I think, with the epistles. It's kind of applied theology in a local church in a particular setting. And I think it's the years in a particular setting where, as you're doing theology and applying it in a missional context, a lot of truth comes out, a lot of revelation comes out. So actually, my books come out of my journals and my learnings. And then just when I feel like, oh my gosh, like this is tremendous, I go back to my journals and I put it all together and poof. Well, it's not just a poof, obviously, but it's out of that comes the book.
That's fantastic. All right, so the title of the book itself implies that if there are emotionally healthy leaders, there must also be unhealthy leaders in the context of the church. And we're talking about pastors and church leaders. How in the world can pastors and church leaders get to an unhealthy place, Pete?
Well, let's put it this way. How do you not? I mean, the pressures are so enormous, and there's so much coming at us from every direction that it takes great character, I think, equipping and training to remain grounded and to grow in Christ while leading a church into mission, into the world. So I think really the larger question is, how can we not? I mean, we should assume we're going to go down a bad path, because it takes a level of equipping and training that it almost has to happen on the job. And so I think we underestimate how challenging it is to walk with Jesus in a healthy way, have a healthy life, and lead a healthy church that's actually missional and growing. That's a rare combination.
Mm-hmm. So with that, what are some of the red flags that we should be noticing? Just those warning lights on the dashboard that we're moving in a challenging direction, and we need to give attention to this.
Well, it's interesting. You said your focus, Tony. I follow your work as organizational leadership and development and strategic planning. And what happened for me in 2007, I hit a wall, and this is like post my other books. And our church had grown, quite large, about 1,500 adults, and we have a community development corporation on the side, which is its own entity, but it's organically connected to the church. So a lot of employees, a lot of budgets, all that strategic planning, and I realized something wasn't right in me in terms of when we got to planning and decision making, culture and team building, how we set boundaries. Something in my own personal life needed to be adjusted in terms of depth. And I'll call it in my character, in my inner life, in my emotional health. And so I kind of went through, I call it my fourth conversion. And out of that, I actually became the executive pastor for a short season. And because I wanted to get involved in the nitty gritty and not just do the vision stuff and in a sense, the easier stuff, I would say vision casting, preaching, but to get in there with job descriptions, hiring and firing, all that difficult stuff that often a COO does or an executive pastor does. And I just realized I couldn't delegate my dirty work anymore. It was because it wasn't about technique any longer. It was about the character informing the technique. And it began with myself. And so that's what got me on this journey. So I did end up identifying 4 major issues that I think are unhealth, which end up informing the way we do organizational leadership as pastors and leaders. So my first is face your shadow, okay. Which basically is, how is what was called the dark side of who you are affecting the way you're planning and making decisions? How's it affecting the way you're building a team? And I think it's, and not just in a sin, not talking about just sin. I'm talking about just the aspects of my life where, okay, I'm pushing to grow the church, but how much of that might be driven, not just for the glory of Jesus, but actually for me to be approved, or to see like, oh, wow, I'm somebody, I made it. Or wanting excellence, but it crosses over into perfectionism. And now I'm mean to people, that kind of thing. And I think really looking at that is very critical for leaders. That's face your shadow. Second, has to do with your marriage, leading out of your marriage or singleness. That's been a big theme for us for 19 years. And, evolved theology that I'm actually leading out of a health and a joy of my own marriage or singleness that informs the kind of culture I'm building in the whole church. Then there's a whole slowing down for love and union, that I'm leading out of an abiding life that's actually an overflow of Jesus. We're not CEOs, we're not social workers, we're followers of Jesus, and it's Jesus out of us that needs to come out of everything we're doing organizationally. But that's not that easy to do, as you know. Mm-hmm. And then lastly is a whole rhythm of Sabbath and work. So I identify those four out of whack: low self-awareness and being too busy or too much going on to sustain what we're doing for God. Those are the core issues, I think, that I would define as unhealth.
It's interesting that you mentioned marriage as one of those 4. Way back when, in my early days of ministry, my boss at the time, Mark Beeson at Granger Community Church, used to talk as part of his job description, being a good husband to his wife and a good father to his kids. And I was early on in my leadership and my ministry life, I thought, this is crazy. We're all supposed to do that. Why do you sense that that's a part of your job description? But and now 15, 20 years later, I look back and I realize Mark was right. You have to prioritize that. That becomes a part of your job and how you lead, coming out of the relational health you have in your marriage. And I would extend that to parenting as well, Pete.
Absolutely. In fact, I would even extend it even further and say that our marriages are meant to be a sign and a wonder. And it's actually the loudest gospel we preach to our churches. And that investing in a high quality marriage, which actually is a picture of the depth of the love of Jesus, of passion, of fruitfulness, that we offer that to our churches we lead. That is an incredible message without us opening our mouths. And I think that's what Ephesians 5 is talking about. And I think that's more than just keeping the spouse happy. It's like, no, there really is an overflow here of our sexuality, our joy, that's integrated to leadership. And I think, it sounds like he did a great job of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, you also mentioned in that the Sabbath, and I'd love to get your take on this because it's interesting. Number one, I rarely hear pastors teach on it, and I'm assuming why is because they're not practicing it. And then the question is, so why not? Why do you think it is that leaders, particularly church leaders, I would say, fear practicing Sabbath?
Well, I think for me, I think the issue is, again, I think it's theological. I think that we wrestle. I did for years theologically getting a hold of the Sabbath, and I got legalism on one end where it's a blue laws and, that's one extreme. The Pharisees did that well. And you got the other extreme is it's irrelevant because Jesus is our Sabbath rest. We're headed for an eternal Sabbath rest. So we don't worry about it. He's fulfilled that. And I think that's both of them are extremes. And I would argue incorrect theologically. I would put Sabbath keeping as a spiritual formation discipline, like prayer and Bible study. It doesn't save you. I mean, Christ saves us alone, but it's a core spiritual practice of the Christian life, that rhythm. And I think number one, most pastors don't even understand it. And I was in that. I went to two great seminaries. We just didn't talk about it. It was never discussed. And then you add to that Western culture, workaholism. We are what we do. Our identity is built in that, and the whole package is. We end up working. We have a quote day off, but I like what Eugene Peterson says: a day off is a bastard Sabbath, because it's not a Sabbath. It's a day off. But a Sabbath is to the Lord our God. It's got certain qualities to it, and it actually informs our lives. It slows us down. When I meet a pastor, I want to get a sense of. I want to get in 5 seconds. Give me an oil light of how your life is. I'll just say, tell me about your rhythms of Sabbath. And if they're not Sabbathing, in every case so far, it's been they're doing too much. Something's out of whack. It's like the oil light. Something on that engine needs to be adjusted. But once I find people taste Sabbath, it's like a deliverance. It's like a deliverance from Pharaoh, like the early Israelites. They were under Pharaoh for 400 years, work. And you set people free to actually enjoy Sabbath, enjoy God's grace and love and delight. It's like a deliverance. Like, oh my God, I'm free. Like, free people can actually rest. Slaves can't rest. And I think sometimes we've been duped. I actually think it's a big spiritual warfare issue. I do. I think it's about powers and principalities. I don't just Sabbath for myself. I Sabbath for our whole church, because I'm resisting powers and principalities and saying my value and worth is not in what I do. It's in Jesus and his love for me. And that alone in our culture is such a statement. It's radical and freeing, and then hopefully invite others into the same kind of rest.
That's good. You mentioned in that commonly when they're not practicing Sabbath, they're doing too much. Are there some common things that you see church leaders doing too much of?
Yeah, I think the first is the prior question is, what do you need to have a relationship in which your cup is overflowing with Jesus? What kind of being rhythms do you need in your weeks, in your months, in your years? And then once you determine that, then you say, what do I have left over for work? So, for example, I need a good amount of silence and solitude if I'm going to be able to walk into meetings and give some good leadership. And now I'm different than you, and we have different personalities and temperaments and callings and all that. So you got to determine out of your own, calling with God and who God's made you, what do you need with God? But what pastors are doing too much of is, I would say, what they're doing too little of is with Jesus. I think Sabbathing, investing in their marriage, silence, solitude. I'm a real believer in like daily offices, meeting with God, 2, 3, 4 times a day, not just once a day in the morning. Really my life is not pastoring and leading. My life is Jesus. And that has to be settled, because if that's off, it affects how we're building the organization. And often we end up doing things God never asked us to do. And we're not going to have the kind of power in what we're doing without an inner life with Jesus. That's why for me, the book, I couldn't separate. I knew everybody wanted me to go to like the outer life issues, like planning and decision making. That's every leader wants to start there. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think that my main point is that you cannot separate your interior life to everything you're doing with strat ops or your exterior life. And that you can't just take a secular method of planning or decision making or culture and team building and slap it on your church without addressing your inner life, because that informs everything you do more than the actual process itself. The processes are great, but you cannot separate it you can't just graft into the tree something that's not flowing out of the inner life of the roots of that tree. And I think I tried to do it for years, and I finally came to a place of realizing this doesn't work. I mean, it works short term, but I always felt, Tony, something was missing. And I love strategic planning. I mean, over the years, I've brought in so many different people to lead us in a strat ops. And I believe every church needs a consultant to come in, like periodically, to come from the outside, give some objective, perspective, lead you in a process about what's God calling you to do, and et cetera, et cetera. I think I've been doing that for decades, and I believe everyone needs it. So we need people like yourself doing what you're doing. Very important. However, that needs to get integrated with the process of, well, what is God's will for us, and how do we discern his pace and his will for us as a leadership? How do we discern his voice together? Slowing down enough, even in those meetings, to have time to listen to God, to listen to the inner movements of the heart by the Spirit of God in us. And so all that just takes time. It just slows you down. And what success is for one church is not success for another church. I had somebody ask me for a 20,000 member church. He's on the executive team, and he said, Esme, like, Pete, I don't get it. Like you're, and Rich now, who's my successor, Rich and you guys, you're just not pushing. And, you're 1,500 adults, you got a couple thousand people here, it's growing, but you should be pushing for multi-site like now. We're going to, we're planning multi-site and all that. But we definitely, and he says, I'm trying to get a hold of it. And I ended up turning to the book and I said, let's define success. What is success? And I said, I'm into numbers because Jesus wants to reach the world. I said, but that's a very narrow view of success. Success is doing what God's called you to do. And I said, so at our church, at least, New Life Fellowship Church, we define success a bit more broadly than simply numbers. Because you can have a lot of numbers and not be successful. That's it's so I realize a definition of success by simply being bigger and better is not biblically accurate. I mean, it's American accurate, and I'm not saying but I'm for growth. Mm-hmm. I mean, people are just like, they're against numbers, and no, I think we should be seeking to reach people for Jesus and expanding our influence for Christ. I mean, we're not monasteries. We're local missional churches.
That's great. Well, before we started the interview today, I mentioned to Pete, my primary focus is around the organizational health at a church. And the challenge, though, is I can help a church get clarity on mission, vision, their strategy, everything that they're doing as far as next steps. If the leader isn't healthy, all of that is for naught. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed the conversation today, but more importantly, I hope you'll pick up the book, The Emotionally Healthy Leader from Pete Scazzero. It just came out end of June. I'm sure that will challenge you as a leader to take your next steps. Pete, thanks again for joining us today.
Tony, thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you. God bless.